You don't belong here.
This is my porch. Check the deed before you touch me.
The HOA says otherwise.
Stop pointing. This is my property.
You're hiding from the rules.
The rules were written by me.
The silence on the porch of 101 Sterling Lane was so thick you could have cut it with a hedge trimmer, specifically the one Regina Vance was so obsessed with. Regina's face had gone from a fiery, indignant red to a ghostly, sallow pale. She stared at Sergeant Miller's tablet as if it were a portal to another dimension, one where her authority didn't exist. The younger officer, who had been so ready to reach for his handcuffs minutes ago, now looked like he wanted to melt into the stone steps. He shifted his weight, his leather gear creaking in the stillness. Sergeant Miller, a man who had seen everything from domestic disputes over a lawnmower to high-speed chases, looked at Arthur Sterling with a newfound profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. He knew that men who owned entire blocks of million-dollar real estate usually had the cell phone numbers of mayors, governors, and very expensive law firms. "Mr. Sterling," Sergeant Miller began, his voice dropping the authoritative edge it had held earlier, "I think there's been a very significant misunderstanding here, a failure of due diligence on the part of the reporting party." He shot a look at Regina that was cold enough to freeze her Cadillac's engine. Regina, however, wasn't ready to give up. Her ego was a massive, fragile thing, and it was currently under siege. She began to stammer, her hands fluttering near her throat. This can't be right. The records at the county office, they said the developer was Sterling Global. They didn't say it was him. And even if he built the place, that was 30 years ago. The HOA was formed to protect the residents from things like this, from people who think they can just ignore the rules because they have money. He hasn't paid a single monthly assessment in 5 years. That's over $50,000 in back dues, plus interest and penalties. Arthur stood up then. He didn't do it quickly, but there was a grace to his movement that commanded the space. He was a tall man, and when he stood, he seemed to tower over Regina, despite her being on the lower step. "Regina," Arthur said, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady, "I haven't paid HOA dues because the HOA bylaws, the ones you clearly haven't read in their entirety, specifically exempt the declarant from assessments on any property they hold. In fact, if you look at the fine print of the community charter, the HOA is actually supposed to pay me a nominal land lease fee for the ground the clubhouse sits on, a fee that I have waived for the last 3 decades out of the goodness of my heart. But since you're so fond of the rules, perhaps I should start collecting that debt, with interest, of course." Regina looked like she was about to faint. You can't just... The clubhouse is community property." Arthur smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had just found a very slow-moving target. "It's community property as long as the HOA is in good standing and follows the developer's covenants. One of those covenants, Regina, is that the HOA board cannot use its power to harass, intimidate, or discriminate against residents. You've spent the last hour trying to have me arrested for squatting in a house that I designed, built, and paid for. You've used the local police department as your personal goon squad. That's a violation of the very charter that gives you your little plastic gavel." Sergeant Miller cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling, is there anything you want us to do? At this point, it's clear no crime has been committed by you. In fact, we might be looking at a false report charge here." Regina's eyes went wide. "False report? I was acting in good faith. I thought he was an intruder." Arthur looked at the sergeant. "I'm not interested in filing charges against the department, Sergeant. You were just doing your job, though I'd suggest a bit more skepticism when Mrs. Vance calls you in the future. As for Mrs. Vance, I think she and I have a lot more to discuss, but it won't be on my porch. It will be at the emergency board meeting I'm calling for this evening." Regina tried to find her voice. You can't call a board meeting. Only the president can call a meeting, or a majority of the board." Arthur pulled his phone out again. "Actually, as the declarant, I can call a meeting at any time for any reason with 0 notice required for the board members. It's a supermajority clause. I've already sent the digital notice to the other 4 members of the board. I believe they're quite surprised to find out who their new neighbor is. And I've also invited my legal team to perform a spot audit of the HOA's financial records. You see, Regina, when I saw your Escalade pull up, I noticed the new Orchards HOA logo on the door. I don't recall authorizing the use of community funds for personal vehicle branding." Regina's mouth hung open. She looked like a fish out of water gasping for air. The younger officer actually had to turn his head away to hide a smirk. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt different. Arthur turned to the officers. "Gentlemen, you're free to go. I'm sure you have actual work to do. Mrs. Vance, you are currently trespassing. I suggest you get in your SUV and go home. You'll want to spend the afternoon gathering every receipt, every bank statement, and every minute book from the last 3 years. My lawyers will be at the clubhouse at 6 p.m. If a single page is missing, I'll be moving from civil litigation to a criminal referral for embezzlement as fast as it'll make your head spin." Regina didn't say a word. She turned on her heel, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and practically ran to her Escalade. She peeled out of the driveway, her tires screeching. Another violation of the HOA noise ordinance, Arthur noted silently. The police officers offered a final apologetic nod to Arthur and retreated to their cruiser. As they drove away, Arthur sat back down in his chair. The tea was cold, but he didn't mind. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Marcus, did you get all that? Good. I want the full forensic team on those books. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen it look this managed. I want to know where every cent of those assessments has been going. If she's been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank while harassing my neighbors, I want her house. Literally. Check the lien clauses." The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of activity. News in a neighborhood like the Orchards travels faster than a wildfire in a dry canyon. By noon, the squatter at 101 story had been replaced by the billionaire founder return story. Arthur watched from his window as neighbors he hadn't seen in years suddenly found reasons to walk their dogs past his house. Some waved tentatively, others looked away in shame, likely remembering the times they had stood by and watched Regina bully someone over their trash can placement. But Arthur wasn't interested in their apologies yet. He was focused on the files Marcus was sending over. The HOA's financial history was a mess of consulting fees and special projects. Regina had been the president for 5 years, and in that time the annual budget had tripled, despite no major improvements to the common areas. In fact, the community pool, the one Regina had accused Arthur of illegally using, had been closed for repairs for the last 2 summers, yet the books showed $40,000 spent on pool resurfacing each year. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he scrolled. He saw payments to a landscaping company owned by Regina's brother-in-law. He saw administrative expenses that looked suspiciously like a European vacation. At 5:45, Arthur swapped his robe for a bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't need to dress up to prove his power, but he wanted Regina and the board to understand exactly who they were dealing with. He walked down the hill towards the clubhouse, a grand colonial-style building that he had designed to be the heart of the community. As he approached, he saw 4 cars parked in the lot, the other board members. They were standing in a small cluster near the entrance, looking nervous. Among them were Bill, a retired accountant, Sarah, a stay-at-home mom who liked the social status of the board, and David, a local real estate agent who should have known not to cross Arthur Sterling. When they saw Arthur, they went silent. Bill stepped forward, his hand extended. "Mr. Sterling, Arthur, we had no idea. Regina told us the house was being occupied by a professional squatter who had forged documents. We were just trying to protect the integrity of the neighborhood." Arthur ignored the hand. He walked past them and opened the heavy oak doors of the clubhouse. "Protecting the neighborhood involves knowing who lives in it, Bill. It also involves fiduciary responsibility. I suggest you all take a seat. My legal team is already inside." The clubhouse great room was staged like a courtroom. Marcus, Arthur's lead counsel, sat at a long mahogany table with 2 junior associates, all of them surrounded by stacks of binders and open laptops. Regina was already there, sitting in the corner, looking small and defeated, though there was still a glint of defiance in her eyes. She had brought her own lawyer, a man who looked like he specialized in slip-and-fall cases and was clearly out of his depth. "Let's begin," Arthur said, taking his seat at the head of the table, the seat Regina usually occupied. "This is an emergency meeting of the Orchards Homeowners Association. Item number 1 on the agenda, the immediate suspension of the president's authority pending a full financial investigation." Regina's lawyer jumped up. "Now, wait just a minute. You can't just walk in here and—" Marcus didn't even look up from his laptop. "Actually, he can. Under the 1988 Development Agreement, Article 9, Section 4, the declarant holds veto power over all board actions and retains the right to remove any officer for cause. Cause, in this instance, includes, but is not limited to, the filing of a false report against the declarant and the suspected misappropriation of funds. Arthur looked at Regina. "I've spent the afternoon looking at the books, Regina, or rather the lack thereof. You've been running this HOA like a South American dictatorship. You've levied over $200,000 in fines against residents in the last 24 months. Fines for things like non-harmonious curtain colors and excessive bird feeder activity. And yet the Common Area Fund is nearly empty. Where is the money, Regina?" Regina gripped the edges of her chair. "The money went to the community. We had a drainage issue on the north side. We had to update the security system. You haven't been here. You don't know how hard it is to maintain a high-end community in this economy." Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the room. "A drainage issue, Regina? The city handled that. I checked. And the security system, the one we're using right now, it's the same one I installed in 2012. You haven't updated a thing. What you did do, however, was pay Vance Property Management, a company registered to your home address, $12,000 a month for consulting. That's a direct conflict of interest and a violation of state law." The other board members looked at Regina in horror. "Regina, is that true?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "You told us that company was a third-party firm from the city." Regina didn't answer. She looked at her lawyer, who was busy looking at his shoes. Arthur stood up again, pacing the length of the room. "But here's the real kicker. Regina, you've been trying to evict me because you wanted my property. You knew that if 101 Sterling Lane went into HOA foreclosure for unpaid dues, the board would have the first right of refusal to buy it at a fraction of its value. You were going to use the embezzled funds to buy my house and flip it for a $3 million profit. You weren't protecting the neighborhood. You were hunting it." The room exploded into shouting. Bill and David were demanding to see the records. Regina's lawyer was trying to call for a recess, and Regina herself finally snapped. She stood up, screaming at Arthur. "So what? You're a billionaire. You don't need this house. You have 10 others. We live here. We do the work. Why should you get to keep the best plot in the county while we struggle to keep our property values up? You're an absentee landlord, Arthur. You're the real parasite here." Arthur waited for her to finish. He waited until the echoes of her scream died down in the vaulted ceiling of the clubhouse. "A parasite?" he asked softly. "Regina, I am the host, and you are about to find out what happens when the host decides it's time to clean house." He turned to Marcus. "File the injunction. I want the HOA's bank accounts frozen by tomorrow morning. And Sarah, Bill, David, if I were you, I'd be looking for very good lawyers of your own, because as members of this board, you are personally liable for the oversight of these funds. Unless, of course, you'd like to cooperate and tell us exactly what Regina told you to sign." The air in the clubhouse was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Regina Vance's lawyer was whispering frantically in her ear, his face a mask of panicked sweat, while the other 3 board members, Bill, Sarah, and David, sat in a row like children waiting for a lecture from the principal. Arthur Sterling didn't look like a man who had just been threatened with jail. He looked like a king reclaiming a throne he had long ago vacated but never truly lost. He stood at the head of the table, his hands folded calmly in front of him, watching as Marcus, his lead attorney, began to lay out a series of folders that looked like the blueprints for a demolition. "Let's be very clear about where we stand," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the room like a razor. "This afternoon, under the authority of the declarant power held by Mr. Sterling, we executed a digital freeze on all HOA operational accounts. We also served a subpoena on the bank for the last 5 years of transaction history. What we found in just 3 hours of preliminary review is not just a misunderstanding, Mrs. Vance. It is a systematic, calculated looting of community funds." Regina tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not finished. we've identified over $400,000 in administrative fees paid to a shell company called Vance Property Management. We've also found that the pool repairs were billed by a company owned by your brother-in-law, a company that has no business license and no insurance. In legal terms, this is embezzlement, fraud, and a massive breach of fiduciary duty. Sarah, the board member who had always been Regina's shadow, let out a small sob. "We didn't know, Mr. Sterling. Regina told us the funds were being moved for tax purposes. She said you were a threat to our property values. We just wanted to keep the neighborhood beautiful." Arthur looked at her, his eyes cold. "Beauty isn't built on lies, Sarah, and it certainly isn't built on the backs of your neighbors. You signed the checks. You approved the minutes. In the eyes of the law, your ignorance isn't a defense, it's an admission of negligence." He turned his gaze back to Regina. But Regina is the architect of this disaster. She didn't just want the money, she wanted the power. She wanted to decide who was worthy of living in the orchards. And she decided that I, the man who dreamed this place into existence, didn't fit her aesthetic. Regina finally found her voice, though it was cracked and shrill. "You think you're so much better than us because you have the money to buy the law? This was our community. We did the work while you were off in New York or Europe. We kept the grass green. We kept the riffraff out." Arthur laughed, a deep, resonant sound that made Regina flinch. "The riffraff, Regina? Is that what you called the elderly couple at 204 who you fined until they had to sell their home? Or the young family at 112 who you harassed because their children's playset was 2 inches too tall? You didn't keep the neighborhood beautiful. You kept it terrified. But that ends tonight." Arthur stepped away from the table and walked toward the large window that overlooked the community pool, the pool that had been closed for 2 years while Regina pocketed the maintenance funds. Under the terms of the original charter, the declarant has the power to dissolve the homeowners association if it is found to be in persistent violation of the founding covenants. I've spent the afternoon consulting with the city and the county, and because the HOA has failed to maintain the common areas and has engaged in documented discriminatory practices, I am exercising that right. Effective immediately, the Orchards Homeowners Association is hereby dissolved. The room went silent. The implications were staggering. Without an HOA, the property values wouldn't necessarily drop, but the board's power and Regina's reign of terror was evaporated. More importantly, the common area land, including the clubhouse, the pool, and the parks, would revert to the ownership of the declarant, Arthur Sterling. Regina's lawyer stood up, his voice trembling. "You can't do that. The residents have a right to their amenities." Marcus stepped forward, dropping a heavy document on the table. "They do, and Mr. Sterling will be gifting those amenities back to the city as a public park and community center, managed by a professional municipal staff, not a group of power-hungry amateurs. The city has already agreed to take over the maintenance, funded by a small, fixed-rate municipal assessment that is 70% lower than your current HOA dues." The other board members looked at each other in a mix of shock and relief. Their power was gone, but so was the crushing weight of the liability Regina had led them into. But Arthur wasn't done with Regina Vance, not by a long shot. "Now let's talk about the restitution," Arthur said, turning back to face the group. "The $400,000 you stole, Regina? I've already filed a civil suit to recover it, and since you used your own home as collateral for the business loans you took out in the HOA's name, a very foolish move, by the way, I've placed a lien on your property. By the time my legal team is finished, you won't just be out of a job, you'll be out of a house." Regina collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. The bravado, the arrogance, the grayish authority she had wielded like a weapon was gone. She was just a woman who had tried to play a high-stakes game against the man who owned the casino. The younger police officer, who had returned to the clubhouse at Arthur's request to ensure the peace was kept, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice respectful, "the sergeant is outside. He says the district attorney has been notified of the forensic findings. They'd like to speak with Mrs. Vance down at the station." Regina's lawyer looked at her, then at the officer, and simply sighed. He knew there was no defense for what Marcus had uncovered. As the police escorted Regina out of the clubhouse, the very building she had used to intimidate her neighbors for half a decade, a small crowd had gathered in the parking lot. Word had spread through the neighborhood through group chats and phone calls. When the neighbors saw Regina being led to the police cruiser, there was no cheering, only a profound sense of relief. They saw Arthur Sterling emerge from the building, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the residents of the orchards began to clap. It wasn't just for the end of the HOA, it was for the return of the man who had built their homes with the intent of creating a community, not a cage. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of the orchards was nothing short of miraculous. Without the constant threat of fines and violations, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. People actually started sitting on their front porches. The weeping willow in Arthur's backyard remained, its branches swaying in the breeze, a symbol of a rule broken for the sake of beauty. The pool was finally resurfaced, this time by a legitimate contractor hired by the city, and the clubhouse became a place where neighbors actually met for coffee, rather than for sentencing hearings. Bill, Sarah, and David were forced to pay significant fines to settle the civil claims against them, and they all resigned from any form of community leadership, living out their days in quiet shame. Regina Vance was not so lucky. The criminal charges for embezzlement and wire fraud were ironclad. She lost her home to the lien Arthur had placed on it, and she spent the next 3 years in a state facility, far away from the manicured lawns and dusty pebble shutters of Sterling Lane. Arthur himself didn't sell the house Regina had tried to take. Instead, he moved in permanently, becoming a fixture of the neighborhood he had created. One evening, a few months after the HOA was dissolved, Arthur was sitting on his porch again. The sun was setting, and the neighborhood was filled with the sounds of children playing and the distant hum of lawnmowers, people cutting their grass because they wanted it to look nice, not because they were afraid of a ruler. Sergeant Miller pulled up in his cruiser, but this time he didn't leave the lights on. He stepped out and walked up to the porch. "Evening, Mr. Sterling," he said, tipping his cap. "Just doing a routine patrol. Everything looks quiet." Arthur smiled and offered him a seat. "It is quiet, Sergeant. For the first time in a long time, it's exactly the way I planned it." Arthur Sterling had spent his life building things, skyscrapers, housing developments, a legacy. But his greatest achievement wasn't the bricks and mortar of the orchards. It was the moment he stood his ground against a system designed to exclude him from his own creation. He had proven that wealth and power are temporary, but integrity and justice are the foundations that truly last. As he watched the stars come out over the block he owned, he knew that he wasn't just a developer or a billionaire. He was a neighbor. And in the orchards, that was finally enough.
Thank you for joining us for this 3-part journey on Honorbound Tales. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how much power someone thinks they have, the truth eventually comes to light, especially when they're up against someone who knows the rules better than they do. If you enjoyed this story of justice and ultimate revenge, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Honorbound Tales for more unbelievable stories. And one last time, comment your location below. We've loved seeing where all our viewers are from during this series. Until next time, keep standing your ground.